Okay, this is the second half of the review. This is the part where we calculate the lengths of all the sides of the quadrilateral, and we calculate all the slopes, and we try to figure out which of the quadrilaterals it is. And here is the flow chart of that. So once again, we first ask ourselves, is it a parallelogram, trapezoid, or kite? If we decide it's a parallelogram, we must go on and ask ourselves, is it a rectangle or a rhombus? If we decide that it's not, we have to show why it's not a rectangle and why it's not a rhombus. If we decide it's a rectangle, we have to decide if it's a square. If we decide that it's not a square, we have to show somehow on the chart why it's not a square. Same thing with a rhombus. If we decide it's not a rhombus, no. If we decide it's a rhombus, but we decide it's not a square, we have to say why it's not a square. If we decide it's a trapezoid, we have to say why it's not an isosceles trapezoid. If we decide it's a kite, we're done. If we decide it's an isosceles trapezoid, we're done. If we decide it's a square, we're done. We do not have to explain further why it's not something else, because there is nothing more specific than a square or an isosceles trapezoid or a kite. See if you can keep all that in your head at once, my friends. Okay, so here we go. First one. Looking at problem number one. We look at the lengths and the slopes, and we ask ourselves, is this thing a parallelogram? Well, yes, it is a parallelogram, because both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. Okay, so it is a parallelogram. So then we have to ask ourselves, is it a rectangle or is it a rhombus? Well, it's not a rectangle, because these sides, the consecutive sides, are not perpendicular. I know that because these are not opposite and reciprocal. So, and here's how you indicate this, and this is not optional. I will draw a circle like this, and off to the side I will write not a rectangle. Okay, that is not optional. And I know this is not a rhombus, because if it were, then these, well, all the sides would be the same, including these. So again, this is not optional. You circle a pair of these, and off to the side you write not a rhombus. Okay, and now it's time for the explanation. You can write, this is a parallelogram because both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. All right, let's move on to number two. Let's see, is this a parallelogram? Radical 17, 2 radical 17, 2 radical 17. Same thing with the slopes. So yes, this is a parallelogram. Now we have to ask ourselves, is it a rectangle or is it a rhombus as well? It's definitely not a rhombus, because all of the sides are not congruent. But the slopes are what tell us if it's a rectangle. Looking at these slopes, this is a rectangle, because the slopes here are opposite sign and reciprocal. That means that these consecutive sides are perpendicular, which means it has to be 90 degrees. It's a rectangle. So, as far as my explanation, so for an explanation you can write, it is a rectangle because it has 4 right angles. That's the definition of a rectangle. But then we have to say why it is not a square. Okay, we have to say why it's not a square, because we're going with rectangle. Square is the next thing down on the flowchart, so we have to say why it's not a square. And the easiest way to do that is just to circle these. This pair of lengths tells us that's not a square. If this were a square, all of these sides would be the same. And we say not a square. Just like that. All right, let's move on to number 3. Let's see here. Is this a parallelogram? No, it's not a parallelogram. Nate, these opposite sides right here are not parallel, so it's not a parallelogram. So then we move on in the flow chart. If it's not a parallelogram, is it a trapezoid? Well, what's a trapezoid? A trapezoid has exactly one pair of parallel sides. Okay? And this does have exactly one pair of parallel sides right here. These sides are parallel. We know that because the slopes are the same. So that's why these sides are the bases. So this is a base, because they're the parallel sides, BC is a base and AD is a base. Okay, look, because when you're thinking of a parallelogram, you're thinking of something like this, and these sides are the parallel sides, and this is a base, and this is a base. And the non-parallel sides are the legs, so that's leg, leg. So yes, this is a trapezoid, because it has one pair of parallel sides. But then, if we decide it's a trapezoid, then we have to decide, is it an isosceles trapezoid? So, if it's an isosceles trapezoid, then the legs have to be congruent, leg, leg. Remember, the legs are the non-parallel sides. So if BC and AD are the bases, because they are the parallel sides, that means AB and CD are the legs. Okay, so that means that the radical 58, that's a leg. And this radical 58, that's a leg. These legs are congruent, so this is in fact an isosceles trapezoid. So here comes the explanation. It is an isosceles trapezoid because it has exactly one pair of parallel sides and the legs are congruent. See, I got the trapezoid part in there and then the isosceles part. I do not have to say why it's not something else because isosceles trapezoid is at the end of the line. There's nothing more specific than an isosceles trapezoid. All right, let's move on to number 4. Okay, let's see what we have here. All of the lengths are the same, so it's definitely a parallelogram. Also, look at the opposite slopes. Both pairs of opposite sides are parallel based on the slopes. So it's a parallelogram. Next we ask ourselves, is it a rectangle? Is it a rhombus? Well, all the sides are the same, so it's definitely a rhombus. Okay, so fine, it's a rhombus. Now we ask ourselves, is it a square? Well, if it were a square, then these sides would be perpendicular. And these slopes, if they're perpendicular, would be opposite, sine, and reciprocal. Since they're not, we can conclude that this is not a square. Okay, so it's not a square, but it is a rhombus. But that's as far as we got. So here comes the explanation. It is a rhombus. I want to put that in all caps, rhombus. It is a rhombus because it has 4 congruent sides. Notice the pattern. Whatever you're going to say that it is, start off by saying it is a blank because, whatever it is a rhombus because, let's look back through it. It is a rhombus because it is an isosceles trapezoid because it is a rectangle because it is a parallelogram because. That looks so tiny now. And then after you say because, go ahead and just mention the definition of that thing. Parallelogram, because both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. That's the definition of a parallelogram. It is a rectangle because it has 4 right angles. That's the definition of a rectangle. Okay? It is a rhombus because it has 4 congruent sides. That's the definition of a rhombus. Okay? Follow that pattern and you'll be fine. Let's move on to number 5. Okay, we start by asking ourselves, is it a parallelogram? Well, both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, so it is a parallelogram. Next, we ask ourselves, is it a rectangle? Is it a rhombus? Well, we see that all 4 sides are congruent, so it is definitely a rhombus. So far, here we are at rhombus. Now we have to ask ourselves, is it a square as well? Well, if it's a square, then these consecutive sides will be perpendicular, and these will be opposite sign and reciprocal. And yes, this is a square. 1 and -1. This is sort of a special case because -1 is like -1 over 1. The reciprocal of 1 over 1 is, of course, still 1 over 1. So 1 is the only number that's the reciprocal of itself. So these are opposite reciprocals. So this is a square. Please note, if this had been like -5 and 5, this would not be a square, because the reciprocal of 5 is 1/5. This only works for the number 1. Anyway, here comes the explanation. It is a square because it has 4 congruent sides, and 4 right angles. Okay, notice we do not have to go ahead and say why it's not something else, because square is the end of the line. There's nothing more specific than a square. Let's go on to number 5. Is this a parallelogram? No, this is not a parallelogram. Look at these opposite sides. 2 over 7, 11 over 12. Opposite sides are not parallel, so it's not a parallelogram. Is it a trapezoid? All right, that's where we move to next, is trapezoid. No, it's not a trapezoid. None of the sides are parallel. Nothing is parallel. The definition of a trapezoid is it has 1 pair of parallel sides. This has none. So it's not a trapezoid. Well, that just only leaves one thing. It must be a kite. Now, a kite, of course, should have 2 pairs of consecutive sides that are congruent. And this has that. It's like this. Here's a kite. A kite has 2 pairs of consecutive sides that are congruent. EF is radical 53, so that would be like here. Okay, FG is radical 265, so that would be here. Then GH is radical 265, which would be here. And then EH would be radical 53, which would be here. So as you can see, even though it looks at first glance like EH and EF are far apart from each other, This wraps around because it is a closed shape. So actually EF, and all the way around like this, came EH, but really they are right next to each other. So please keep that in mind. The bottom of the chart and the top of the chart are actually consecutive sides. So we do have two pairs of consecutive sides that are congruent, which is the definition of a kite. So we would say this is a kite because it has two pairs of consecutive sides that are congruent. Of course, consecutive means right next to each other. Don't forget to add on this extra part in parentheses, but not all four sides are congruent. Or I could have said, but opposite sides are not congruent. Something so that a rhombus will not be counted as a kite. If we don't specifically say not all four sides are congruent, this part that we wrote first could have applied to a rhombus, because a rhombus also has two pairs of consecutive sides that are congruent. But this part at the end excludes a rhombus from being a kite, so that's very important that you have that written down. Okay, two more. Looking at number 7. Okay, first we ask ourselves, is this a parallelogram? Well, I'm seeing the zeros. These opposite sides are parallel. But what about these? 2 and -4/3. These opposite sides are not parallel. That means it is not a parallelogram. Okay, well, so it's not a parallelogram. Whoops. So then I ask myself, is it a trapezoid? Well, the definition of a trapezoid is it has one pair of parallel sides. Well, this does have exactly one pair of parallel sides, doesn't it? Okay, these sides are parallel, and these are the only sides that are parallel. So this is a trapezoid. So I know that. That means these are the bases right here. Okay, this is a trapezoid. If these are the parallel sides, then that means this is a base, and this is a base. Whoa. Okay, that means these other two are legs. Okay, so this is a leg, and this is a leg. Okay, if this is isosceles, because we just have to find out is it isosceles, but if this were isosceles, then the legs should have been congruent, and they are not. So we will write a note off to the side pointing at these two legs, and we will write not isosceles. And then we will go on and write our explanation. For the explanation we write, it is a trapezoid because it has exactly one pair of parallel sides. Okay, last one, number 8. First we ask ourselves, is this a parallelogram? Well, look at these opposite sides, -1/3, -1/8. The opposite sides are not parallel, so it's not a parallelogram. Next we ask ourselves, is it a trapezoid? Well, a trapezoid would have one pair of parallel sides, but none of these slopes are the same. So that means it's not a trapezoid either, because there's not a single pair of parallel sides. That means all that's left is a kite. And once again, the definition of a kite is we should have two pairs of consecutive sides that are congruent. And we do. Here's a pair of consecutive sides that are congruent, and here's another pair of consecutive sides that are congruent. So this is a kite, and here comes the explanation. And here is that final explanation. It is a kite because it has two pairs of consecutive sides that are congruent. But not all four sides are congruent, because that would be a rhombus, and we cannot have that being a kite. So there it is, boys and girls. Just to summarize, notice I wasn't showing my calculations, but you do have to show your distance formula. We use the distance formula to find all these lengths, and we use the slope formula to find all these slopes. So you need to show those calculations, even though I did not. But please make sure you give a thorough explanation using this pattern. If you, whatever you think it is, say it is a blank because, and then basically say the definition. Also, please do not forget, if there's something more specific on that flowchart, you have to explain why you did not go further with it. If you say it's a trapezoid, you need to circle the legs and say why it was not isosceles. Alright, there's nothing more specific than a kite. There's nothing more specific than a square. But if you say it's a rhombus, you have to circle some slopes and say and show that that's why it's not a square. These would have been opposite and reciprocal. These are not reciprocal. If you want to say, well, isosceles trapezoid, you can't get any more specific than that. If you want to say it's a rectangle, you have to explain why it's not a square. Circle these lengths. If it were square, those would have been the same. So these show it is not a square. And if you want to say that something is a parallelogram, you have to show why it is not a rectangle, because of these slopes are wrong. If it were a rectangle, it would be opposite and reciprocal. But you also have to show why it's not a rhombus. Circle these two lengths. If it were a rhombus, these would have been the same, so these prove that it's not a rhombus. Okay, that's all for this lesson.